Welcome to the second lecture for Chapter 4, Interpersonal Perception. In this lecture, we are going to be expanding on what we talked about in the perception process, really expanding on that last stage of interpretation, essentially really thinking about how our interpretations of behavior work to explain other people's behavior. And this is important because in our relationships, we often want to know why people act the way they do. And that's really what we're going to be talking about in this lecture today. Before we get started talking about attributions or the explanations of other people's behavior, I want you to reflect on a situation in which you try to explain another person's behavior in which you are in a relationship with. So first I want you to choose a relationship that's important to you, and then I want you to think about and describe a recent negative interaction with that person. Talk about what reasons you would you use to explain your behavior in that interaction, and what reasons would you use to explain the other person's behavior in that interaction. So when we explain other people's behavior, we are essentially engaging in the attribution process. Attributions, again, essentially an explanation of why a certain behavior occurred. And making attributions are important in relationships. We'll talk a little bit about the factors that go into the attribution process, but we'll also talk about attribution errors. And when we make attribution errors, when we make errors in our explanations of why other people do the things that they did in our relationships, this can create problems and conflict in our relationships. So it's important to understand this process, potentially to reduce the level of error and the attributions that we make, as well as in that way reducing potential conflict or trying to understand why other people made errors in their attributions to help resolve and think about the root of those conflicts. So we think about attributions along three important dimensions. The first is locus, the second is stability, and the third is controllability. And that's really what we're going to be talking about, these three dimensions here in the lecture today, before we go on at the end of this lecture talking about attribution error. So the first is locus, and this really refers to the cause of the behavior, really where it's located, whether it is within ourselves, which would be internal, or whether it's outside of ourselves, which would be external. So internal causes could be caused by a certain characteristic of ourself or another individual. So if we're thinking about, reason why somebody did something, an internal cause or locus would be that they are a bad friend, or that they're lazy, or they're inconsiderate, or that they're really supportive. So thinking about a positive spin to that. But essentially explaining behavior because of some sort of internal characteristic about that person. The other source or locus could be external factors. So was this caused by something outside of the person's being? When we think about external causes, reasons why somebody did the way that they did, maybe they were being forced to, maybe they were tired, maybe, when I think about why did a student come late to class, right? I could think about it being, a traffic jam, the other instructor held them late, right? So there's all these kind of external reasons as to why they're late to class, as opposed to a potential internal reason, which could be that they don't like my class, that they're a bad student, that they don't care about their academics, right? So all of these internal characteristics as to why they would be late. So again, we can really see kind of the cause of the behavior being because of the person's, characteristics or personality traits, internal locus, or some sort of external cause of that behavior. The second is stability, and stability really refers to whether the cause of the behavior is due to something that is permanent, semi-permanent, or not easily changed, or something that is unstable. So really thinking about is this reason going to be consistent, or is it some sort of temporary state as to why the person acted the way that they were? So when we think about, again, the student being late to class, I could think, if it's maybe an external factor of the instructor before my class keeping them late. That could be something if they're constantly tardy, is a fairly stable behavior, and that could be because the instructor is constantly keeping them late, or if they're constantly oversleeping, so it may be an internal characteristic there. And so thinking about, what's kind of the consistency or the stability of this behavior. And lastly, we have controllability. So are the causes for the behavior, how much control does the person have in whether or not they could engage in that behavior or not? So thinking about, the being late for class example, if there was an accident on the interstate and as they were commuting, and they were stuck in traffic, there's really no control that that person has over that, right? So the controllability here would be really low. They have, you have no way really of predicting if there's somebody who's going to be in an interstate accident in front of you. But there are other, reasons that the person may have more control over. So the example of them maybe oversleeping their alarm, that to me, you have some sort of controllability there that you could, set a backup alarm or kind of do other things that are going to help you get up for class. I think this one is the most subjective in terms of whether or not the person providing the explanation feels that the other person has control. And this is really where we see in conflict in interpersonal relationships, discrepancies, right? You may feel that the other person has control over that behavior, but the person may not feel that they have control. And we can really see here in this controllability factor where arguments and conflicts can reside, and even potential, thinking about errors in our explanations here because of the subjectivity of whether, our assessments of whether the person has control over that behavior. Another thing I want to point out is that these factors influence one another, right? So I took in these examples for stability and controllability, I used the earlier reasons that I provided for internal and external causes. So these things don't happen in isolation. These three factors really interact with one another to provide explanations for why people act the way that they do. And so really providing us three guidelines that influence one another and help construct our explanations of other people's behaviors in our relationships. So I mentioned at the start of the lecture that we don't always have the best accuracy in explaining other people's behavior. And communication scholars have recognized this and have really identified some fundamental errors, common errors that occur when we are working to explain other people's behavior. And your chapter talked about these errors as well. The first is the fundamental attribution error, and this is essentially that it says that we attribute other people's behaviors to internal causes more often than external causes. So, kind of when we are explaining why somebody is late to class, this error states that we more often are going to attribute it to some sort of internal cause, that they don't like my class, they're a bad student, they're, do not have control over their own behavior, right? As opposed to external causes, the traffic accident, the instructor holding them over, right? So these fundamental attribution errors that in our relationships, we more commonly attribute the person's behavior to those internal characteristics as opposed to potential external factors that may be influencing their behavior. The self-serving bias really focuses on how our attributions of ourselves, of our own behavior. So we tend to attribute our own successes to internal causes and our failures to external causes. So really thinking about, kind of the example I often give are students who performance on an exam, right? So if a student gets an A on a test, they're going to say that it's because they worked hard, they deserved it, they're really good at the content. But if they got an F on the test, they, according to self-serving bias, they may say that they did poorly on the test because the test was too hard, and the professor is unfair, and they're not a good instructor. And so thinking about this in terms of it could possibly be a combination of those two things. But none of us are responsible for all of our successes, and none of us are responsible for all of our failures either. So when thinking about our relationships, it's important to remember kind of this self-serving bias that all the successes in your relationships aren't necessarily due to your own internal characteristics, as well as all the failures aren't always due to these external causes in your relationships as well. The final attribution error is over-attribution. And over-attribution occurs when we focus on one characteristic of a person and really attribute a wide variety of behaviors to that characteristic. This really goes along the lines of stereotyping. And so thinking about, picking on one specific attribute and attributing their behavior to that. And so, one common stereotype or over-attribution that I can think of is that, the old adage cliche that blondes tend to have more fun, right? So, or that they're ditzy. And so taking that one attribute, the physical attribute of having blonde hair, using that to maybe, explain potential ditzy behavior or, just kind of a fun-loving attitude. And this is really easy, that was a kind of a trivial example, but we see this happening a lot in marginalized groups, right? Another one I can think of is maybe like height. So if you think somebody is, a man is really, really tall, some people might attribute that they play basketball or that they're good at sports, right? And so really thinking about how these over attributions can influence our assessments of other people.